sailboat must be one of the best of human inventions, going through the water using nothing but the wind. But we didn't come out here for an ecology lesson. We came out to learn something about the body, and a sailboat can help teach us about how the body stands up. We're used to looking at structures like the lighthouse in the building behind me, where you've got one brick piled on top of another brick, all sitting on solid main granite, so that it's a continuous compression structure all the way down from the top of the lighthouse to the ground. And we think of our skeleton as being the same way, the head piled on top of the thorax, and the chest on top of the pelvis, and the pelvis on top of the legs. But you know, if you disappeared all of the soft tissue, the skeleton would fall to the ground. And a sailboat is a little bit instructed like that. A body is more like a sailboat than a lighthouse. The mast is kind of like a bone, or a series of bones like the spine, and the stays, the shrouds, are really like the myofasciae of the body, offering extra support in a tensional way, not just a compressional way. If you suddenly disappeared all these stays off the sailboat, the mast would fall down under the pressure of the sail. You really need these guys on this side to keep it tight. If we went over and waggled the shrouds on the other side, you'd see that they were very loose. But when we turn the boat the other way, they'll be tight again. Same thing is true of the body. If you look at this structure here, this is kind of taking the sailboat idea to an extreme. These tensegrity structures were invented by Kenneth Nelson, a sculptor, and popularized by Buckminster Fuller, a designer in the 1960s. It works off a whole new geometry. But if you look here carefully, you'll see that the dowels are supported in a balanced way, without even touching each other, by the balance of the rubber bands. And the body is very much the same way. If you disappeared all these rubber bands, all the dowels would clatter to the floor. And the same thing is true of the body. If you disappeared all the soft tissue, all the bones would clatter to the floor. We have this kind of illusion because we look at those skeletons in the classroom. They're all wired together, so we think of the skeleton as a solid framework on which the muscles work, but it's not that way at all. The bones float in the soft tissue in the same way that these dowels float inside the rubber bands. Now, when you start to look at these structures, they have a bunch of interesting properties that are very much like the properties bodies have. If I create a shortness in this part of the soft tissue, you can see that the whole structure deforms in a way. Let's see if I can keep it still enough here so that you can see that. See how the whole structure goes? So I could have a shortness over in this part of the body and be complaining of pain over in this part where it's changing. The same thing is true of structural body work. You can have somebody saying, oh, the pain's in my neck. And I start to work over here, and they say, no, the pain's up here in my neck. I say, well, that may be where you're hurting, but this is where the problem is. This is where the shortness is. Kind of bone manipulation techniques like chiropractic and osteopathy tend to look at knocking the bones back into place, which can also work to restore balance to the structure of the body. But long-term chronic postural difficulties are often set in the soft tissue in such a way that resetting the bones simply won't last. The soft tissue will again pull the bones out of place. So what we're looking at here in terms of what we want is an even, balanced tone across the myofasciae of the body so that the bones will stay lightly, easily floating in place. The Anatomy Trains theory is looking at how the myofasciae of the body cover the bones, not just this muscle going from here to here, but in the series of continuous rubber bands that work their way around the human structure, which is a good deal more complicated than this structure, so that we can achieve the kind of balance that leads to ease and harmony and a lack of pain. So the traditional view of the body, in fact, the view espoused by my teacher, Ida Rolf, sees the body as a bunch of blocks, and she had the bunch of blocks inside the plastic bag there, and it's a question of how do you arrange the blocks inside the plastic bag to get a natural alignment of the body. And that's a powerful image, but you can get even more powerful about the effectiveness of myofascial work if you look at the geometry, at the balance in the geometry between tension and compression. So, next slide, please. If you consider the body as a bunch of blocks, then you want to line those blocks up, boom, 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 on the gravity line. And if you're leaning back, it'll go into tension on the front. And if you lean forward, it'll go into tension on the back. So we begin to see the guy wires that are holding the skeleton up as beginning to be important, but we can get even a little more sophisticated than that. Following on that traditional way of looking at the body, if you look here, what we have is a block of wood sitting on a horizontal block of wood going down to the two, and the lines that are drawn on there are showing how the stresses go. And of course that's very similar to how the spine sits on the pelvis, sits on the legs, and you can see in the lines of stress drawn in there, you can see the sacrum defined in the compression here, that kind of triangle. You can see the pelvic floor defined in the tension that goes underneath, and you can even see the femoral heads defined in the compression that's coming up from the other legs. You can see a very similar thing here and an actual cut through the pelvis, how the sacrum sits down on this block of wood, which sets down into there, and both the soft and the bony tissues arrange themselves in that way. But now here's a little more sophisticated in the sense of the balance between tension and compression. More sophisticated in this case is 1938. You see the body segments lined up here, but the MCs are the muscle centers. The muscle centers counterbalance the tendency of the blocks to curl up into the fetal position, and so there's one on the bottom of the foot, one on the back of the leg, one on the front of the thigh, in the butt and the lower back, the chest and the neck. And the figure on the right gives us an example of what can happen if that starts to get out of balance. What you get instead is tightness in the shins, tightness in the hamstrings, tightness in the groin, tightness in the mid-back, tightness in the throat. Okay, so this slide shows us what we were looking at on the boat, but more precisely, exactly how the mast of the spine is arranged like a sailboat. If you look at the boat there, you have the two shrouds coming from the front of the boat up to the top of the mast, and then in our case the scalenes going down to the gaff of the first rib, and the rib cage is like the sail, and then the sail is from the boom, which would be the bottom of the rib cage, is sheeted back to the hull of the pelvis by the rectus abdominis. So we really are arranged like a sailboat, and that allows the mast to be thinner and lighter than it otherwise would have to be. But it's still a continuous mast from the head down to the sacrum, and ours is a segmented spine. So let's look at something even a little more dependent on the tension. This is a beautiful structure constructed by a German architect named Otto Frey. What you're looking at here is almost like the stem of a plant. In fact, he was looking at how do sunflowers turn and face the sun as the sun changes in the sky all day. And he came up with this kind of structure where what you've got is a series of independent segments that fit into each other like a ball into a socket, or one golf tee into another would be the closest thing I could think of. And around each golf tee is a plexiglass circle, which they cut into triangles with holes drilled through it. And say you start in with 12 lines going up through this thing. The 12th one ends at the last circle. But the 11 keep on going through, and then the 11th one is tied off here, and the 10th, 9th, 8th, 7th, 6th, 5, 4, until you get to the top one, which only has that last cable, which has gone all the way up the inside here. Now, you have a mess of cables down here. You have 36 cables. I did 12. I don't know how many this is, but I'm doing 12 for a reason. You have 36 cables down here. You've got to tie up all those cables around drums, but if you did that by winding this drum, this drum, this drum, this drum, this drum, you could take this tent mast and put it anywhere you wanted it to be in any shape. And our back does the same thing. You kind of get in under the cupboard under the sink, and then you look around till you can see the nut, and then you go back that way so you can get your arm in, and then you put your arm in and get the drain off the bottom of the thing. There are muscles like this, the iliocostalis in your back, that do exactly this kind of thing from rib to rib to rib, and allow your back to stabilize itself in whatever godforsaken position you have to get it into to do whatever chore you have to do on a Sunday afternoon. So this more approaches what a spine is in terms of the balance between tension and compression, because here first, this is the first structure that we've seen that if we cut all the wires, it would fall down. And that's the same is true of your spine. And we can go even a little farther down that road. These structures are called tensegrity structures, and were invented by Kenneth Snelson, an artist, and popularized by Buckminster Fuller. And if you look at this structure, you can see that none of the sticks are touching each other. They're all held in place by the balance of the rubber bands, or wires, or whatever they used here. This is quite an amazing structure, and as you can see, it's amassed kind of like the spine, and none of those wooden things are touching each other. They stay right where they are on the balance of the rubber bands. So I brought a couple of these models in for you to look at. Why don't you play with this, pass it around, and I'll talk to the people in video land with this one. As you can see, the bones, the dowels, are floating in the balance provided by the rubber bands. In fact, you could say that the dowels are pushing out against the rubber bands, and that's the conception of the bones in the myofascial meridians theory. And these rubber bands that go continually around the whole structure are the myofasciae, the myofascial meridians. And where they tack down to the bones are what we've been calling the stations. This is another way of looking at the whole thing. These structures have a number of properties that are a bit like bodies. For one thing, if you put stress into this structure, for instance, if this was a whiplash or this was an injury of some sort, you see how the strain is taken by the whole structure. It's not right where the impact comes. The impact is distributed through the myofasciae all over the structure. And of course, these rubber bands are the pathway by which the strain is distributed. The other thing is, look at these two dowels here that are parallel to you. If I push these two dowels together, the other two dowels are going to go apart, right? The ones that are parallel to you, watch. As I push these dowels together, the other dowels come together too. You can see it that way also. Bodies act the same way. If you put strain and stress into one part of the body, the whole body shrinks. It shrinks in height, it shrinks in width, it shrinks in depth. It doesn't have to shrink in all three of them, but it can. And as you unravel the body, as you unwind the body, as you let go of the strain in the myofasciae, what you see is an expansion that happens all over the body. You get an expansion in width, an extension in depth, and an extension of height that Rolfers tend to call lift. The other thing about these structures that's interesting is if you take and you put strain in one piece of the myofasciae, you might see a problem emerging somewhere else, right? Not anywhere near where the problem is, because as the strain takes itself around the structure, the pain may end up somewhere else. So that's another thing in myofascial work that we look at is you might be working quite far from the site of injury or the site of pain. Okay, so just to reiterate, the reason for this journey through geometry is to see that the dowels are like the bones and that they push the myofasciae apart. And the myofascia are like the rubber bands that are holding the bones in place. And in this conception, and the power of this conception is that you can see how balancing the myofasciae will set where the skeleton sits. So that we can really powerfully change the whole structure, myofascial and skeletal, by working with the myofascial system.